When you think about the combined industries and economies and populations of all the European nations, plus Canada, it dwarfs Russia. So what's been missing is self-confidence and political will.
Ben, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has given a stark warning about the military capabilities of Russia, despite its invasion of Ukraine taking its toll. During a speech in London, Rutte warned that Moscow is producing 4 times more ammunition in just 3 months than the whole of NATO does in a year, and that it would be ready to attack allied countries by 2030. He also said that if defence spending isn't a priority, we'll all need to start learning to speak Russian.
If we want to keep our societies safe, and look, if you do not do this, if we would not go to the 5%, including the 3.5% core defense spending, you could still have the National Health Service, or in other countries their health systems, the pension system, etc. But you'd better learn to speak Russian.
That is Mark Rutte there. Pretty strong stuff. Joining me now, Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of US Army Europe. Good evening, Ben.
Hey, Kate.
We'll talk about the sort of wider defence spending context in a moment, but just something specific from today. Mark Rutte calling for a 400% hike in air and missile defence capability throughout NATO countries. A quantum leap he's asked for in collective defence. I'm sure you're going to agree with that. Why the particular emphasis on air and missile defence? Is that something that nations are particularly deficient in at the moment?
Well, it's a great question. And yes, we are all very deficient in air and missile defense. The United States has only 1 battalion of Patriot in all of Europe, and that's just enough to protect Ramstein Air Base, which is our main air base in Europe. We should assume that if the Russians have made the terrible decision to attack any NATO country, they will have already made the terrible decision to launch air and missile attacks against our transportation infrastructure, the quantity and the type that we see happening in Ukraine almost every night, because they know that NATO's response is based on moving troops across Europe by land and sea. So every airport, every seaport, rail would be hammered by Russian missiles and drones.
Okay, well, thank you for breaking that down for us today. Look, he's been pretty strongly spoken today, Mark Rutte, and talked about the fact that Russia are ready to attack a NATO country by 2030. He's given that line about the fact that if we don't start spending properly, we're going to need to start to speak Russian. I mean, who's he talking to here? Because this is quite sort of strong, kind of assumed knowledge, I suppose. Sort of, it's almost quite pantomime-y. You know, you're going to have to start speaking Russian unless you pay attention to this. You know, most nations, most leaders of nations, certainly defence secretaries, treasuries of countries, understand that we are living in times of increased threat. So who is Mark Rutte speaking to today when he goes along those lines?
Well, I think the Secretary General is trying to spark a sense of urgency to get things done. I mean, when he says, you know, the amount of ammunition that we're able to produce is pitiful, it will take a long time to increase the amount of ammunition that's required. So that's why he's trying to inspire all of us to take a hard look at our defense industries and make the decisions necessary to increase that production. So that's a part of it. But I think also this is time for all of our elected officials to speak to us as if we are adults and explain what the risk is. I mean, I believe the Russians are actually already at war with us now, not in the traditional sense, not an Article 5 type, but everything that they're doing out in the Baltic Sea, for example, or in the North Sea, all of this violation of airspace, violation of freedom of navigation, destruction of undersea infrastructure, sabotage, assassinations, all of these things that they have been doing the last few years that I think we would call this disruption operations. These, until NATO figures out how to address that, they're going to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And these are all the kind of preparations you would do ahead of a more conventional attack.
Is NATO too obsessed by Russia?
No, I think NATO is not obsessed enough. There are too many countries that still are like, are you really? I mean, the Canadians are celebrating that they're going to finally get to 2% here in a year or two. I mean, Canada is a country that has a lot at stake, both in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, and especially in the Arctic, where Russia is the biggest threat. Other countries, way below what they should be. And while I support almost nothing that President Trump ever says, he's completely right that nations have not been doing enough. Now, I'm old enough to remember, as are tens of thousands of your listeners, in the Cold War in the early 80s, when all the nations were spending 4 and 5%, and you still had all the other things that were going on. So it is possible, if political leaders explain why it's necessary, that you need to have capable militaries, not just money for modernization, but for readiness, to train, to make sure you have enough women and men in all of your units and services. This is a part of protecting our populations. And when you look over the last 20 years, all the bad stuff that Putin has done, that all happened after the U.S. Army sent home almost all of our troops, after the UK sent home almost all of its troops from the continent, after the German Bundeswehr became a shell of what it used to be, and after the Dutch also got rid of all their tanks. So this war in Ukraine is what failed deterrence looks like.
I asked the question about obsession with Russia, and you're right, NATO should be obsessed by Russia, about whether that in turn means that perhaps there isn't enough focus on other countries that could threaten us, like China and Iran, whether we are, or NATO could be guilty of not considering those threats, even allowing them to fester further because of the attention. We all understand why there is war in Europe for the first time in decades and decades. We understand why we're focused on Russia, but I wonder whether that means that countries that pose other threats could well strike without being, or without going noticed.
Okay, so this is a very good and fair question. But of course, none of us, UK, US, anybody gets to choose who the threats are, but you do have to choose the priority and how you deal with each of these threats. And I think the United States, plus some allies like Australia, Japan, and South Korea, and to some extent the UK, are going to have to be able to deter China from making a terrible decision, and doing that with our European allies carrying the bulk of the load for deterring Russia. I believe that if we help Ukraine defeat Russia, that will send a powerful message of deterrence to China when they see that the West does have the political will and the industry and the capabilities to do that. And it also, by the way, would lead to the isolation of Iran. So helping Ukraine defeat Russia, this is a lot more than just charity for Ukrainians.
Mark Rutte also said today that Ukraine is still on an irreversible path to NATO. That is going to annoy Russia a lot because one of the conditions for a ceasefire has always been, and this is, arguably one of the sort of least demanding conditions, is that Ukraine doesn't join NATO anytime soon, or in fact ever. And we know that Donald Trump has said this too, that Zelensky is going to have to abandon, going to have to sacrifice his want to be a part of NATO if he's to get anywhere close to achieving some sort of deal with Vladimir Putin. What do you think about it? Dangerous to rile Russia in this way, from Mark Rutte?
Russia doesn't get riled by anything that we do. Russia is provoked by our weakness. When we demonstrate that we are cowering in front of them, or we take every little threat that they make, we take it serious, that's what provokes them to do more. As I said earlier, all of their aggressive activity, starting back with their invasion of Georgia in 2008, happened after we all basically disarmed in the West. So I think support for Ukraine joining NATO is not going to cause Russia to do something different. I mean, Finland and Sweden joined NATO because of Russia attacking Ukraine. When Ukraine joins NATO, and I believe they will, then the alliance will immediately get better that day, because you can see that Russia is unable to defeat Ukraine right now. Now, I think President Trump's, unfortunately, his approach to getting this famous deal with Russia about Ukraine was doomed to failure from the beginning because the Trump administration never understood the history, the culture, the reasons for the conflict. They couldn't even say that Russia was the aggressor. And they demonstrated that they don't care about Ukraine, actually. And so I think that's why, and the people they had working on it, incompetent. So Ukrainians and Europeans realize that they're going to have to do this without much American help, unfortunately.
Look, I wonder if if there is any uneasiness about the power that America currently holds within the NATO partnership, within the NATO Defense Alliance. Rightly, America puts in an awful lot of cash. Donald Trump has a big say. And I wonder whether that makes anyone uneasy in light of, well, let's look at his approach to those protests in LA, bringing in the National Guard. He is unpredictable. Does he carry too much power in NATO? Does there need to be a warning there for Mark Rutte about how he balances the power given to Donald Trump in light of national stability, safety throughout the world?
So I am very confident that Secretary General Rutte and most of the other European leaders, including your prime minister, understand President Trump now better than they did before. We just saw the German Bundeskanzler, Friedrich Merz, have a very successful Oval Office meeting, and it was successful because he went in there. He was not intimidated. He spoke with confidence, and he had a good news story to tell about German defense spending. So I think that the best way to deal with President Trump is to stand up to him, be confident. Don't come in there thinking you can flatter him or come hat in hand. But I think Secretary General Rutte sees that. I'm glad that my president has said, no, we're not leaving Germany. We're not pulling troops out. Yes, the president will be at the NATO summit. It's embarrassing that that was even a question, but it is. But I think it's also time for our European allies plus Canada to realize that if for some reason the United States said, okay, we're done, told you, you guys are not doing enough, Europe still has the potential to be able to defend itself. When you think about the combined industries and economies and populations of all the European nations, plus Canada, it dwarfs Russia. So what's been missing is self-confidence and political will.
Ben, always great to speak to you. Thank you. Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of US Army Europe. But good to speak to you. Thank you.